Welcome to Nobilis Erotica, episode 316. I am your host, Nobilis Reed.
Welcome to Nobilis Erotica, the only podcast that dares to kiss and caress your pulsating flesh, torment and tease wherever it will please. Should you find crass language and adult themes unsettling, listener discretion should keep you from meddling.
This week's episode is sponsored by JMS Books, LLC, a rather queer small press, jms-books.com. This week's story is Crises of Faith by Elizabeth Luck Brooks, from the anthology Whetting the Appetite, published by JMS Books. Masquerading by day as an uptight, faceless cog in a gigantic corporate machine, Elizabeth spends her evenings writing and editing gleefully smutty stories. She writes mostly sci-fi, fantasy, and romance, or any combination thereof, and has been published at Torquay Press, Claes Press, and by the short fiction site 365 Tomorrows. Small world. When she's not writing, she loves reading, role-playing games, photography, scrapbooking, and geeky gadgets. She currently lives in Virginia with her 2 beautiful children and an endearingly annoying cat. It's read by Tonya M. Idlewine, a feast or famine tweeter, a not as active as she should be sex blogger, and maybe someday a podcaster. Her blog can be found at www.tisfortmi.com, and you can follow her on Twitter as @tisfortmi.
Crises of Faith by Elizabeth L. Brooks. The cock churned in her, and Faith made the noises the cock's owner expected, but in truth she barely felt it. It couldn't touch the burning, couldn't slake the need. She'd tried, God's witness she had. The burning had come on her along with her moonblood, but she'd pushed it from her thoughts, concentrated on her crafts and her skills and her lessons, and she'd held it off 2 full years before her oldest brother had caught her trading kisses with one of his cronies behind the gooseberry patch. She hadn't lied, not quite, but she'd let Tom and their parents think it had gone further than that, and before another year was out, she'd been wed to Nicholas. The first weeks had been jolly, but then Nick had lost interest, and Nick's ma'am had started ordering her about like a drudge, and the next few years had been a misery of scullion work and a burning that never left her, not even when Nick would get drunk enough to remember the wife that warmed his bed and come home from the pub to put his cock in her. She tried to be good, but when Nick's da had died, his widow took to beating Faith in addition to just harping at her, and so Faith had taken her best dress and run away. She'd let the man who drove the hay cart put his cock in her in exchange for a ride up to the city. When she cut the hem off her dress and took up with Singing Jenny, the 2 of them selling what they had to sell in the side streets and alleys. None of the men touched the burning, though. She'd tried to relieve it herself, but her own hands only stoked the fire. The cock's owner grunted and jerked, and then tossed a few pennies on Faith's bodice before she pulled out. Faith didn't move until he was gone, though the soft stir of air on her nether parts fanned the flames. When the shadows were still again, Faith mechanically tucked away the pennies and wiped off the cooling seed and smoothed her skirts down over her legs before resuming her stroll through the alley. Hands caught her waist from behind, and she managed not to sigh tiredly as she leaned back into the embrace. "Shilling she started, and then gasped as she realized there was no man at her back. "Shh," the woman whispered into Faith's ear. Her hands cupped Faith's breast through the stiff bodice, and Faith let out a quiet whimper as the burn grew hotter. The woman purred, and one of her hands tugged up Faith's skirts. The woman's skin was hot, even through the layers of cloth between them. When she had pulled Faith's skirts up enough to reach beneath, her fingers against Faith's thigh were like branding irons, hotter even than the burning. Faith jerked away, but the woman's other hand was still on her breast, holding her in place with a strength Faith could barely comprehend. Her mouth closed on Faith's bare neck, dropping searing kisses as she nuzzled aside the high collar, exposing Faith's shoulder. Her hand was between Faith's thighs now, dipping into the gushing well there. The cock Faith had barely felt had been thick, but the woman pushed a slender finger up inside, and the burning. It didn't lessen, but it moved, like a living thing, as if this woman's touch commanded it. Faith shuddered and surrendered to the woman's touch, leaning back against that soft chest, opening her legs wider. That finger fucked Faith's hole until Faith was gasping, all but sobbing. The woman's mouth closed on her shoulder again, and Faith felt the barest scrape of teeth against her skin before the woman's iron-hot fingers closed on the nubbin at the front of her secret parts, grasping it gently but firmly, even though Faith herself was convulsing as the fire burst free and spread over her whole body, leaking out her toes and her fingers and into the woman's mouth at her shoulder. As Faith came to herself, the woman purred again. Faith could feel the cool tracks of tears on her cheeks, and her chest still ached from the speed of her breath. The fire was returning already. Faith could feel its tingle deep in her nether parts. "Yes," the woman whispered, her lips grazing Faith's ear. "We're both so hungry. Let us feast, my darling." Her fingers still held Faith's nub, but now they started to move, to circle, to rub, to stroke. Her teeth grazed Faith's shoulder again, and the hand at Faith's breast seemed to move through the fabric to stroke and pinch at her taut nipple. Faith stretched up on her toes, her hips gyrating against the woman's movements, trying to beg for something she hadn't known could exist. The burning engulfed her secret parts and spread until Faith felt she must be consumed by it. She laid her head back against the woman's shoulder, not merely surrendering to, but embracing that unholy touch, desperate for that moment of surcease and freedom. When her release came a second time, the woman bit her shoulder and sucked hard, and it seemed the burning of Faith's need was being pulled out of her into the woman's mouth, and irrationally, Faith wanted to follow. "My darling," the woman rasped, not taking her lips from Faith's shoulder, "you are a treasure, an absolute." But the fire was returning now, though more sluggishly than before, and Faith boldly laid her hands over the woman's and pressed, asking, demanding. 5, 8, 10 times the woman quenched Faith's fires in that dark alley. At the end, Faith was too exhausted to even stand, but the burning was gone, quenched, finally. The woman half carried Faith up the dark stairs to the apartment, but it wasn't until she laid Faith on the narrow bed and began to draw up the coverlet that Faith protested. "Take me with you," Faith begged hoarsely, trying to gather the strength to throw back the counterpane and managing only to lift a hand. The woman kissed Faith's brow and smoothed the bedclothes. "Fear not, my treasure," she whispered. "I'll return soon, and we'll feed again." And so it was. Every night, just as Faith had begun to despair, after a day of cocks that had failed to touch the burning in her, the woman would appear, always from behind. Faith never saw the streets she traveled, and embrace her, and Faith would gasp in surprise before surrendering to those soft white arms, twining her fingers in that silky blonde hair, staring up into those sapphire eyes. The woman never asked Faith to touch her in return. When Faith offered, the woman would laugh and say that her hunger was only for Faith's pleasure, which Faith was surely happy enough to give her. Every night the woman would take Faith's burning into herself, if only briefly, like a chimney flue drawing up the flames. Every night the woman would quench her fires, exhausting Faith to the point of collapse, then take her home and tuck her into bed. Every night Faith would beg the woman to take her when she left, or to stay, but every night the woman shook her head and left Faith there alone, and in the morning the burning had returned. 3 months in, Or mayhap it was 4. The woman brought another with her. Faith didn't realize it until she'd been taken 3 or 4 times, until the fog of the burning had begun to thin enough that she realized the woman was talking with someone else. "Women are risky," Faith heard. "Not this one," the woman said. "It's not simply a longing. She has the true fire in her loins." The woman's hand was on her breast, kneading, pulling at her nipple, but her hand between Faith's thighs was still, and Faith lost track of the conversation as she pulled at the woman's arm and twisted her hips, gyrating in desperate need for relief. Then there was another woman in front of her, a woman Faith had never seen before. She had hair the color of midnight and eyes to match. Dimly, Faith wondered if she might be a gypsy, but her skin was white as a statue's, and no wandering heathen would have such fine clothes. Dress of dark gray lamb's wool over a chemise of black silk, her collar brooch a golden tree with an enameled apple in its branches, the same blood red as her lips. This new woman caught Faith's chin, her touch seared like glowing coals, and looked deep into Faith's eyes. The blonde woman, Faith's woman, moved again finally, twisting her nipple, pulling at her nubbin as if she was milking it, and Faith's wetness willingly flowed out of her until her pleasure overtook her. Her eyes usually closed in that moment of their own accord, but this time her gaze was held by the black-haired woman, and it seemed the burning traveled not into the lips at her throat as it had always done before, but up into her face, still held captive in the black-haired woman's grip, and into the black-haired woman's fingers. "Oh, Jasmine," the black-haired woman sighed. "You were right." "Thank you, milady," Faith's woman, Jasmine, murmured. The black-haired woman lifted her other hand, cradling Faith's face. "Tell me, girl, what is it that you want?" "Milady? I would have your service," the woman said patiently, "and so I must know how I might purchase it." "What kind of service?" Faith asked, suddenly and inexplicably fearful. "Milady operates an assortment of, shall we say, gentlemen's clubs," Jasmine said, her breath wisping over Faith's ear. Her fingers flicked idly over Faith's breast, drew idle circles around her nubbin until Faith's breath was coming again in short pants. "The work would be similar to your current trade, but you'd have no need to seek out clients in this squalor. Milady takes care of her own, I promise you. I'm certain you would be quite popular with certain of our members." Faith writhed under Jasmine's caresses, whimpering, but it seemed Jasmine would allow no more than this fanning of the fire until Milady's question was answered. "Would I be able to see you still?" she finally blurted, wrenching her gaze from the black-haired woman's and twisting her neck to look at Jasmine. Jasmine looked surprised, and for an instant her features were haunted by a ghost of unease. The black-haired woman laughed. "Such strength," she purred. "Of course you shall see Jasmine as often as you'd like. Perhaps I will allow Jasmine to see to your training, once you are settled in, "Oh, yes, please, milady," Faith gasped, and Jasmine rewarded her, pinching and stroking, finally releasing the fire to spread through her limbs. Faith's climax came quickly and then stretched on and on, drawn out of her, shudder by shudder, until so much of the fire had been drained out of her, into Jasmine's lips at her shoulder, into Milady's fingers on her face, that she began to feel cold. "And done," the black-haired woman said, pure satisfaction making her words as thick as cream. "Come now, my dear, and we'll see you settled as quickly as may be." Faith woke and knew 2 things immediately. She was still nestled in Jasmine's arms, and something had changed. Her eyes flew open. "Don't move," Jasmine said quickly, her voice a soft, soothing purr. "And don't speak. Not yet. This part is always a shock, but I know you'll be able to move through it quickly." The burning was gone. Not a hint. Not so much as a thread of heat between her nether lips. Not even a tingle around her nipples. Faith drew a breath in surprise, and something else felt different. "I told you that we were damned," Jasmine murmured. She stroked Faith's arm, and the hairs there seemed unusually sensitive. "You couldn't have known that I meant it literally and precisely. We are damned. They call us the devil's daughters, the succubi, the insatiable demons who feed on the appetites of men." Faith drew another breath, deep and slow. Her chest felt lighter. "They're right," Jasmine continued, "to a point. But unlike other demons, we are not fallen angels. We never knew God's grace." Jasmine's voice broke and then smoothed again. "We were men, nothing more and nothing less. Men, born of women, as all have been since the creation. But we were men unlike other men. Our appetites were too large for our frail mortal bodies to sustain. We took our lovers, not as helpmates as God decreed, but as mere tools to our satiety, with no care for their desires or pleasure. And so this is our punishment, our damnation. In the bodies of those we once despised, our only sustenance now is in the pleasure of others." Faith shook her head, not understanding. "Do you remember your first lover?" Jasmine asked. "No, don't speak, just think of him. Remember the touch of his hands, the feel of his body against yours. Do you recall the color of his eyes? Remember him, my darling, with all your strength. Remember when it was good, when you couldn't get enough of each other, when you couldn't stop touching each other, when you let the dinner burn and the cows go unmilked because you couldn't wait to have each other. Do you remember, my darling?" Faith thought of her Nick in the good years, before he'd grown bored with her and started drinking, of kisses behind the gooseberries and his hands cupping her buttocks as she rode him in the night, and she nodded. "What was his name? Tell me now." "Nico." That much Faith got out before she realized her voice had emerged in a man's deep register. Her eyes flew up and again, and she sat up, ignoring Jasmine's attempt to hold her down. Faith's body was gone, changed. She was a man now. Broader shoulders, flat, lightly furred chest, longer arms that moved awkwardly. Hysteria building, she kicked and shoved at the blankets until her lower limbs were displayed as well. There, yes, between her legs, a cock, limp and dangling on her thigh. "I don't understand," she whimpered, flinching at the masculine tone. Jasmine's arms wrapped around her, him, tightly. "We are the damned," she said calmly. "But you're one of the luckier ones. You were born with the fire, and you were born a woman." "What difference?" "Listen." Jasmine squeezed until Faith could barely breathe. "Those born with the fire make the transition much easier, and they don't seem to feel the hunger as keenly as the rest of us. And you're an incubus now, not a succubus. Much more rare. There are dozens of us for every one of you. That means you'll have an easier time of finding prey to feed on." "Prey?" Even male, Faith's voice spiraled upward in panic. "You'll feel the hunger soon, and you'll understand," Jasmine said, her voice both soothing and commanding. "I'll be the one to teach you. You're lucky, my darling. Usually my lady takes the ones who offend her, in punishment, but you've captured her interest instead." Faith swallowed. "I don't feel lucky," he whispered. His thoughts were a jumble, a whirl. Who is she? "Lady Lucy, our leader, the first of our kind. No one knows where she came from precisely, though you'll hear much speculation. I advise you to dismiss all of it. She was the one who established these houses. Bordellos were a human invention, to be sure, but it was Milady's idea for us to make use of them. But if you live here, how did you find me? Jasmine laughed outright. The first time, I was merely walking by, and your fire drew me, like the scent of roasting meat wafting from a tavern as you pass by. Faith was silent a moment, considering the maelstrom of her mind. Who are you? I'm Jasmine. Who were you? Faith rephrased impatiently. When I was human, I was Marcus Quartus, a Roman soldier in the time of Trajan, 100 years after the birth of Christ. 1,000 questions flung out of Faith's brain, but the one that made it to his tongue first was, "Why did you choose the name Jasmine?" The blonde smiled. "It's customary to take the name of our first lover." Faith blinked. "So I'm Nicholas now?" Jasmine's eyes narrowed thoughtfully. When I asked you his name, I thought you said Nico. You could use that. It will have an exotic appeal. Did you have the fire?" Nico now, was beginning to get used to his voice, or at least he no longer found it startling. "Not like you," Jasmine said. "Yours was very strong." "And that's good?" "Oh, yes," Jasmine purred. "I've not fed so well in years." Nico thought that he should find that disturbing, but he didn't. He realized that he had always been aware, at least on some level, that Jasmine was feeding on his pleasure. "Milady was most impressed," Jasmine continued. "She says that will convert, in you, to an extraordinary ability to control the desires of those we feed on. You could be running your own house in a few months." Nico shook his head. "I don't want to run my own house," he said. Jasmine blinked, surprised. "What then?" Nico touched his quiescent cock tentatively, then stroked it with more confidence. It stirred under his touch, but the burning still did not return. Instead, it awoke in him a more primal and visceral sensation: hunger. It grew, becoming a growling emptiness as Nico stroked himself to full hardness. "I want to feed."
And there you have it. Was it good for you? Tell me what you think by calling the voicemail line, sending me an email, or finding me on Twitter. All these ways to contact me are over on the podcast website at nobilis.libsyn.com. If you like these stories, you can find a bunch more in Whetting the Appetite by Elizabeth Brooks and Lynn Townsend. Find purchase links on the Nobilis Erotica website and help support us. You have been listening to the Nobilis Erotica podcast. Theme music is Cold Funk by Kevin MacLeod at Incompetech.com. Incidental music was by Digital Juice. This podcast is released under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives license. Until next time, listen hard.